Davis, and my research proposal is about the impact of a positive sickle cell trait status on athletic performance and self-efficacy. Now, before I begin, I know that when you hear research proposal, it's very easy to get caught up in the terms and definitions and the protocols, and you use this distancing language like subjects and participants, and that makes it very easy to forget that when you do human research, you're talking about real people who are actually affected by what you're studying. So this is Dale Lloyd II, and in 2006, he was a freshman on Rice University's football team. One day during preseason conditioning, he felt a little more fatigued than normal, but he pushed through as athletes tend to do, and just like all his teammates seemed to be doing. And he continued to push through until he couldn't anymore, and suddenly he collapsed on the field. Less than 24 hours later, he had died. Between collapse and death, he experienced the internal turmoil of his kidneys shutting down, and he felt his own muscles tear apart underneath his skin. He didn't know what was happening to him or why. It was found after his death that Lloyd had been a carrier of sickle cell trait, and this is what caused his collapse and ultimately his death. He was unaware of his status as a carrier because his university had never tested him. The Lloyd family brought a lawsuit not only against Rice University, but the NCAA. And Lloyd's case and others like it resulted in the eventual mandate by the NCAA in 2009, stating that all athletes must be tested for a sickle cell trait prior to becoming eligible for their sport. This can be circumvented if they provide the results of a previous sickle cell trait screening, or if they sign a waiver saying that the NCAA is not held liable for any complications that may result associated with the trait. Now, before I continue, I want to make sure that we're all clear on what sickle cell trait is and how it's different from sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. When someone has sickle cell anemia, they have two sets of recessive alleles for abnormal hemoglobin. Instead of their red blood cells being the regular biconcave shape, the majority of their blood cells are this crescent or sickled shape. And this shape is much less advantageous when it comes to oxygen delivery, and it results in a myriad of health issues that decrease your quality of life and life expectancy. Between 80,000 and 100,000 Americans carry or have sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell trait is when somebody only receives one of these recessive alleles for abnormal hemoglobin, which results in the majority of their red blood cells being the regular circular shape, just like someone who didn't have the trait at all, and they go on throughout most of their life with normal functioning and increase in the same life expectancy as someone who would be unaffected. This is present in about 2 million Americans, and 1 in 12 African Americans has sickle cell trait, which is the demographic for which sickle cell disease and sickle cell trait are most prevalent. So you may be wondering at this point, if there are no real effects to having the trait and it's pretty much benign, then why would it even be relevant in athletes and affect any of the factors that we're studying? Well, when you take the conversation from the general population and shift it to athletes, the story does shift just a bit. And under conditions of extreme heat, exertion, altitude, and dehydration, or any combination of these four circumstances, there is an increased risk for the athlete's cells to sickle and lead to vascular occlusions, which will in turn lead to spleen and kidney damage, renal failure, exertional rhabdomyolysis, collapse, or even sudden death. And what this really means is the newly sickled cells are very stiff and have trouble moving through small vessels, and the shape of them also makes them much more likely to clog. So delicate structures and organs in your body, like your spleen and your kidney, have a tendency not to get the oxygen that they need, which is why kidney damage or failure is a trademark sign of exertional death or illness that's related to having sickle cell trait. Exertional rhabdomyolysis is pretty much much just the breakdown of striated muscle in your body. This means that your body is in such metabolic chaos that it's resorting to protein metabolism or breaking down your own muscles as a last-ditch effort to maintain homeostasis. When this is happening, you're in a very, very poor place physically, and it's hard to get back from that place. So, Ackeriah, Benjamin, Clayton, and Ross found that 65% of the physicians they surveyed expressed serious concern about discrimination for current and future athletic opportunities if athletes were required to predisclose their sickle cell trait status to collegiate healthcare professionals as a prerequisite to becoming eligible for competition. They also expressed a lot of concern for stigmatization and an increased loss of playing time. The American Association of Hematology, which is the world's leading organization on blood disorders, vehemently disagrees with the NCAA's mandate and thinks that this sort of singled out testing increases the likelihood of not only damaging the athlete who has sickle cell trait, but damaging the entire sickle cell disease community as a whole. And they instead support universal precautions like those taken by the military when they are faced with a similar problem with sickle cell trait members who were in basic training. So Lawrence and Shaw found that over 90% of athletes said that they would be very concerned if they found out they had sickle cell trait, and almost 86% of them said that they either thought having the trait would result in less playing time or were uncertain of how having the trait would affect their playing time. And Robinson and Friesen found that how well someone tolerates uncertainty is a huge predictor of the amount of performance anxiety they'll feel during athletic competitions and the robustness of sports confidence. It's no surprise that the worse someone tolerates uncertainty, the less sports confidence they had, and the more likely they were to experience a lot of performance anxiety. And performance anxiety can be broken down into two different components. One is your somatic anxiety, so that's the butterflies, that's the sweaty palms, all those physical feelings of nervousness, whereas the second is cognitive anxiety, which is really just another way of saying worry. And in 1998, these researchers linked worry not only to several serious psychological impairments, but physical impairments as well, which include but are not limited to anxious and depressive behavior, cognitive avoidance, parasympathetic deficiency, autonomic rigidity, and changes in left frontal lobe activation. Wiggins and Brewster's research found that the way in which information is received and interpreted may or may not may negatively affect an athlete's self-efficacy and their perceptions of their ability to deal with the various stressors placed on them by athletics. So Albert Bandura, who is a very famous social psychologist, he pretty much wrote the book on self-efficacy, and he defines that as the belief in one's ability to sufficiently execute a particular task or goal. In 2014, it was found that an athlete's level of self-efficacy directly determines their levels of motivation, emotional stability, determination, and their interpretation and attribution of successes and failures. There was also a program where they manipulated vicarious experience and methods of arousal regulation in track and field athletes to see how that would affect their self-efficacy. And it was found that the intervention group displayed significant improvements in self-efficacy and optimism, as well as had more internal locus of control, whereas the same improvements were not observed in the control group. So I acknowledge that the NCAA's mandate is definitely a step in the right direction, especially if athletes are dying. It's important for that athlete, their coach, and especially their athletic trainers to know that they have this trait. However, it's an incomplete step, and the lack of follow-through or follow-up briefing is what the issue is here. there is, when you just tell an athlete that they have this trait and that it can affect them and have them sign a paper saying that you told them these things and not really explain what that means, then you leave the burden of comprehension up to that athlete. And there is no way to regulate the quality, accuracy, or even the perceived implications of whatever information they find from whatever source they get it from. And considering all the different factors, especially uncertainty and anxiety, and how people can tolerate those things and how it all plays a role in the mental and physical health of that athlete, it's not only a little irresponsible of the NCAA, but it's almost unethical. It's really incongruent with their mission statement, which I won't read word for word, but essentially, when you take a section of student athletes and tell them they have this disadvantage and leave them to their own devices to figure out what that means, then you are not creating a fair environment and you're putting them at a potential disadvantage, not only as athletes, but as people. And that's not really what the goal is in college athletics for your student athlete. So this leads me to my purpose. And the purpose of my experiment is to examine if the manner and tone in which athletes are informed about their sickle cell trait status has a psychosomatic impact on athletic performance and or self-efficacy. And I hypothesized that the delivery of information regarding sickle cell trait status will affect how well the athletes perform under conditions of heightened arousal, as well as how capable they perceive themselves to be at the task at hand. So I recruited 50 athletes, 25 male, 25 female, from 5 East Coast universities with the help of athletic trainers. They just simply told their athletes that they had the opportunity to participate in a study regarding sickle cell trait and athletics at Gardner-Webb University. Because there is a psychological component to my experiment, I wanted to keep the information up front very limited. They, of course, had to fill out the informed consent agreement, which was approved by Gardner-Webb's Institutional Review Board, and they range from 18 to 24 years old. Prior to becoming eligible for the study, I had them fill out the VO2 max and submax metabolic testing medical history questionnaire, as well as a general health history questionnaire, because I wanted to make sure that there are no other conditions that could affect the results of my study. So the different surveys and instruments I used to measure the psychological and physical performances of each athlete were the study-specific knowledge and interpretation survey, which from this point forward I'll refer to as the study-specific sickle cell trait survey, which is a tongue twister, and the general self-efficacy scale, which I'll call the GSE, and the different presentations, which I will be manipulating to either be the positive presentation or the negative presentation. I will get into that much more later. And the task-specific self-efficacy scale, or TSSE. I also will be using the modified three-dimensional model of effort scales that I modified from Hutchinson and colleagues, and they will be rating a lot of these surveys on a 0 through 10 Likert scale, which I generated specifically for this study. Is also color-coded. So on day 1, we asked the participants to arrive at 10 a.m., and we asked that they had abstained from strenuous physical activity 48 hours prior to testing, and that they had a light carbohydrate-heavy breakfast no less than 1 hour before coming into the lab. We had them then sign their informed consent agreement, and then they were administered an ID number, and then they sat and took the GSE. And I did this because I wanted to establish their baseline of dispositional self-efficacy before beginning the study. Then they were told about what the Wingate anaerobic test as well as the VO2 max test were. They were familiarized with the protocols we would be using and given a chance to ask any questions and clear up any ambiguities before undergoing testing. They did the Wingate test first, and then they were given 15 to 30 minutes, depending on when they felt ready, to come back and complete their VO2 max test. They were shadowed for 30 minutes prior to completing testing, given water to help facilitate recovery, and then dismissed to go home. Once all the results had been gathered, the researchers took them and divided them among the positive presentation group and the negative presentation group. And we did this in a way that would be the most statistically even based on fitness scores. So it was relative to our cohort. So we took people who scored in the top 10 percentile of our group and we called them high fitness. We had people who were in the bottom 25th percentile and we called them low fitness. And people in between were called moderate fitness. On day 2, they were asked to return again at 10 a.m. And this took place 72 hours after day 1. We did this because we wanted to minimize both the effects of delayed onset muscle soreness as well as possible anthropomorphic changes which may occur if we did it 1 to 2 or 3 weeks later. They were separated into their groups and called by ID number, and then they all took the study-specific sickle cell trait survey. And this pretty much measured how they felt sickle cell trait affected them as an athlete. Then they were given their respective manipulated presentations. The person in the positive presentation group is manipulating their tone to be more upbeat and encouraging. And the person in the negative presentation group is manipulating their tone to be more severe and concerning, discouraging. And body language, delivery, and tone are all being manipulated by the presenter to make the most dramatic impression. And so the last line in the presentation given to the positive presentation group is that you're brought here today to prove that under reasonable conditions, there is not an observable difference in athletic performance in athletes who carry sickle cell trait. And the last line for the negative presentation group is, you are brought here today to explore the vastness of the performance deficit in athletes associated with your condition. Then they were re-administered the study-specific sickle cell trait survey in order to see if their ratings changed at all from when they took it initially. They were then brought into the laboratory 2 at a time, 1 from each group. And they are under the impression that the other is not carrying sickle cell trait, that they're just a normal student athlete. We paired them based on most compatible fitness scores. So we didn't have somebody who was low fitness against someone who's high fitness. We didn't have someone who scored really high on the VO2 max against someone who scored really high on the Wingate test. The most compatible fitness scores were brought in together. And they were able to familiarize themselves with the TSSE and the modified 3-dimensional model of effort scales in order to make sure they understood the protocols. They read the questions ahead of time. They were given verbal descriptions for the Likert scale, which is on the screen, and what each color and number meant. Before testing, the last thing they were told is your goal is to outperform your competitor during this test. And I did that because I wanted to incite the same cognitive and somatic arousal that someone would experience during a real athletic performance, and also ideally to initiate the same pattern of mental behaviors, be them facilitative or inhibitory, that they would really experience under really heightened arousal performance conditions. So pretty much the protocol is when we did the Wingate anaerobic test, every 30-second recovery interval, they were asked 2 questions from the TSSE. And those were, how confident are you in your ability to endure the test for 1 more testing interval? And how confident are you in your ability to outperform your competitor? Immediately following the test, they are asked to rate their levels of somatic discomfort, how determined they were, how hard they felt that they were working, and how much they wanted to be successful while they were doing the test. And that's from the modified 3-dimensional model of effort scale. The protocol was much the same for the VO2 max test, except for the TSSE questions were asked 10 seconds prior to completing the 60-second time interval, because they would be going up a grade and all of that confusion might skew their ratings and how much they would perceive that they were working, and etc. Subjects were then shadowed for 30 minutes again after testing and given water, and before being allowed to leave, they were debriefed about the true nature of the study and thanked for their time. So I analyzed the data with the repeated measures analysis of variance between both groups to see how the means changed from day 1 to day 2. And then I also looked at the percent increase or decrement, and there's an abbreviated or a quick formula on the screen for how you would calculate that, but between each group. And then also a regression analysis was performed to see how presentation grouping affected their scores on the TSSE and the modified three-dimensional model of effort scales. Lastly, I subcategorized them with accordance to the GSE scores, very similarly to how I did the fitness scores, and it was again respective to our group and our cohort. If you're in the top 25th percentile, you're considered high efficacy. If you're in the bottom 25th percentile, you're considered low efficacy. And if you're in between, you're considered moderate efficacy. And I did this so my statistics were a little more valuable. It is certainly value in comparing people who already have really high dispositional self-efficacy and got the positive presentation to people who have really low dispositional self-efficacy and got the negative presentation, because it does show how dramatic of an effect or the range of effects that information delivery can have. However, I think it's also very valuable to compare how people of similar dispositional efficacies performed as a response to my protocol, and it kind of shows you how much of it was just their personality and how confident they naturally are versus how much of it was my actual intervention. And I would analyze this using a MANOVA and SPSS statistical software. So the most blaring and obvious limitation of my study is that I am not the first to inform any of these athletes that they have sickle cell trait. So all I can do is alter the previous conceptions that they have about it. And if they had a really large knowledge base of what sickle cell trait was and already kind of internalized what that meant for them, then my intervention probably has very little effect on how they're going to perform or how much anxiety they're going to have. Whereas if they have a very narrow knowledge base or know next to nothing about what it means to have sickle cell trait, then I can have a much more significant influence over how they feel about it. I also had to assume that they really did do what we asked them to do as researchers, that they abstained from strenuous exercise, that they had a good breakfast before coming in, they had good rest, and that they didn't discuss the proceedings with each other or outside the group in between times like we asked them to. And also we had to assume that they weren't going through some sort of period crisis which would skew the results of the GSE and their initial dispositional efficacy, but they might just be going through a stressful time in life that could affect how they feel about their selves at the moment. And for future research, it'd be really valuable to examine menstruating women who carry sickle cell trait to see if that loss of blood volume every month plays some sort of role in increasing the likelihood that they will be fatigued or experience unpleasant things related to exercise in extreme or even non-extreme conditions, and also to explore the gender-related differences. It's well known that men have a higher hematocrit than women, have more erythropoietin, and just tend to be a little bit more cardiovascularly superior. So to look into those differences would be very valuable. Acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge my parents because they were here and very supportive of my whole process. And also like to acknowledge Dr. Hartman and Braddock for reviewing my paper and giving me feedback every step of the process. And thank you for your time.